Good afternoon, Year 9. It's me again. Nice to be talking to you through the medium of the internet. I'm really disappointed that I'm not here to teach you this in person because the First World War is one thing I am unbelievably passionate about. So what I've done is I'm giving you a brief introduction to the First World War and how the situation was set up. Now you're looking at this in the context of medicine through time. And you're going to be looking at different battles. Those are going to be the Second Battle of Ypres, where poison gas was first used. You're also going to look at the Battle of the Somme, just the sheer numbers of casualty and the chain of evacuation, how that was used to treat the sick. You'll also be looking at the Battle of Arras, where field hospitals were dug into chalk caves underneath the battle site. And finally, the Battle of Cambrai, the first mass tank battle, really showed which way the war was going to swing, I think. But also was the use of blood transfusions was first used there. So we're looking at within a medical context for your final section of medicine through time. However, I don't think it would be fair to sort of tell you about all of this without giving you a bit of a brief introduction about how it all kicked off. And what we're going to look at are the main causes, MAIN. Now they stand for M, militarism, A, alliances, I, imperialism, and N for nationalism. I'll come on to them again in a minute, so don't worry about that. Off we go. Okay, so as you know, when we studied Koch and Pasteur in 1871, there was a war between Prussia, which is modern day Germany, and the French, and there was no love lost between the two. It was a real shock that the Prussians beat the French, and the French were very, very upset, and they wanted their lands that they had lost back of Alsace and Lorraine. So you see Alsatian dogs, and you wonder why they're called German Shepherds. It's because they've got a bit of a identity crisis. They can't work out whether they're French from Alsace or German Shepherd dogs, because the territory kept switching around. From 1871 it became French to German, and then in 1919 it became German to French again. But rubbing it in is not lost on these two enemies. So for example, here we are in the Hall of Mirrors in the Palace of Versailles, built for Louis XIV, a palace of wonderful regal splendour for the Sun King, and it is where Bismarck, that's the guy over here in the white tunic, the leader of Germany, forces Emperor Napoleon III to sign a peace treaty in this building, in this Hall of Mirrors. It's a very, very beautiful place. I've been fortunate enough to be there. So after 1871 and then 4 and a bit years of bloody warfare, where else should they sign a peace agreement with the now defeated Germans but in, yes, you guessed it, the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles. Now, just as a bit of a historical aside, the French and Germans, don't forget this, the Germans are very, very bitter about Versailles and spend the next 20 odd years fighting literally to repeal it. And this is Foch, General Foch at the bottom down here. He was the commander-in-chief of the Allied forces during World War One, and this is his railway carriage, which is in Compiègne in the forests in France. And this is where, on the morning of the 11th of November 1918, the armistice was signed. The armistice was pretty much dictated to them, but the Germans didn't really have much choice. They had nowhere to go, so they had to sign an armistice, and they decided that in 6 hours' time, at 11 o'clock on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, that hostilities between the two sides would cease. But roll on 22 odd years, and we come to 1940, and the French have been routed. The British have evacuated out of Dunkirk, and the Nazis are now in control of continental Europe and in charge of France. And they make France sign an armistice and a peace treaty. Where do they do it? You guessed it. They dig out, unbrick and roll out Foch's railway car to be in exactly the same spot where they'd signed the armistice on 1917. So, history, I'm afraid, is not lost on these two old foes. but they're not the only two old foes that are squabbling at the moment. Now, if we look at this map of Europe, here we have this disputed area here of Alsace and Lorraine. This is the area between France and Germany that the two sides keep arguing about. The French thinks it should be French, the Germans think it should be German. So there's conflict and tension in Europe here. Also down here in the Balkans here, we have two empires really sort of hacking it out. We have the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which actually really rather includes sort of these areas here as well, including Serbia, and the Russian Empire as well. And they're really arguing over this area down here in the Balkans. Austro-Hungary is nominally in control, but Russia really want the access to these ports because it gives them access to the European markets. So there's a lot of tension down here anyway. This is an area that historically has been full of tension because it's an area where lots of different cultures meet. So you have the Ottoman Empire that still exists at the moment, which is an Islamic empire. You have Russian Orthodox Christians. There's a huge mix of cultures and religions, and there's a huge melting point, and actually becomes the area where the spark for the First World War actually kicks off down in Sarajevo. Serbia, I should say, was its own country at this time. Okay, so what happens? Well, this diagram shows that there was a system of alliances, and it shows you when these alliances were made. Alliances is the A from the main. Alliances are just agreements, non-aggression pacts, or in fact treaties that agree that if one country starts on another, the other country that they've signed the agreement with will come in and help. And as you can see from this diagram, Europe is completely tied up in these agreements, including Britain, but we'll come on to that later. And here in the middle, again, you can see this bubbling pot of the Balkans, of Serbia and Bulgaria, where these sort of two ideologies are, these two great empires really are sort of having a go at one another. So let's just have a look at that in terms of a map. So what we see is the first treaty is between Germany and Austro-Hungary. So Germany, which is coming to the notice certainly of Britain because it's starting to build up its navy. Britain is not happy about that. We'll come on to that again in a minute. But Germany is starting to, flex its muscles a bit, and it says, look, I'm in the centre of Europe here. I'm surrounded by hostile France, hostile Russia. What I need to do is get mates, get friends together, get a gang together, safety in numbers. So I'm going to make an alliance with Austria-Hungary. And that makes them incredibly powerful and dominant in Central Europe. Russia, a huge, incredibly powerful but poor empire, a very weak army but huge in numbers, is starting to get very, very worried. And they make sort of flirting glances at France and say, look, they've made an alliance. What if we make an alliance too? And because these two make an alliance, they're surrounded. Now, what happens if a war breaks out? Well, half of them are going to have to fight Russia, half of them are going to have to fight France. So by fighting a war on two fronts, a western and eastern front, you're dividing the armies in two. And lastly, Italy come and join in. In 1904, I think it is. Let's just have another look. 1904. Britain signs an alliance with France called the Entente Cordiale, and that would bring England into a war if France ever had to declare war on Germany. It's not actually the reason that Britain did declare war. I think England and Britain wanted to stay out of it as much as possible, but they kind of had to get dragged in. But that's an interesting point we'll move on to in a minute. So alliances, these network of agreements, and in practice it takes one small incident anywhere within these groups for potentially a World War to happen. And it did so happen that the Archduke Franz Ferdinand was shot. And he was shot by Serbian nationalists who wanted to be part of a greater Serbia, and a minor royal, not particularly liked by, frankly, anyone apart from his wife. But he and his wife were assassinated by a guy called Gavrilo Princip, who was a Serb nationalist. And Austria say, right, you're going to pay for that. We're going to invade. So here's Austria going to smack Serbia. So we know you did that. But Serbia has a secret treaty, which no one really knows about, with Russia. And this is where it all goes wrong. So Austria, with the backing of Germany, goes in to attack Serbia. Serbia calls up its big mate Russia and says, can you come in and help? Which they do. This then leaves France to declare war also on Austria, by which time Germany has also declared war on Russia. So it set the whole chain of events. Britain is represented by John Bull, no relation, and he comes in a wee bit later. I'll come on to that in a bit. Okay, this is a great quote from Sir Edward Grey. He said, there is no comparison between the importance of the German Navy to Germany and the importance of our Navy to us. Our Navy is to us what their army is to them. To have a strong Navy would increase Germany's prestige and influence, but it is not a matter of life and death to them as it is to us. You've got to remember, Britain is a small island. Germany has an army of almost 1 million men. Britain has an army of around 250,000. Germany has conscription, which means that every adult man will have had to have done 2 years military service. Britain has never had conscription. We are a professional volunteer army. In fact, we're so small, we're not even called an army, we're called the British Expeditionary Force. Britain is a naval power. We use our navy to secure our interests, for trade, and to look after our empire. So we don't have a huge army, we're an island, we don't need it. We need a navy. And Germany is starting to grow her navy. And we had this rule in place called the two-power rule, which means that Britain's navy had to be at least the size of the next two biggest navies combined. And that was a problem because Germany was beginning to grow its navy. Britain's response was this: HMS Dreadnought, launched in 1906, 32 knots, which is about 37 miles an hour. It was the fastest, most powerful ship, heavily armoured, heavily defended ship in the world. It was a game changer. It made all other warships of the period obsolete. It meant they were useless. The guns that you can see at the fore of the ship, they could fire a 100-kilogram shell around 9 miles. This was a piece of kit like you would not believe. And HMS Dreadnought became a class of ship, and I think Britain built about 8 of them, and Germany got a very, very similar design and started building them too. And this leads up to militarism. It is the building up of military power. This is the M of the main. So we've had alliances and we've had militarism. And what this does is if you start building up each other's navies and each other's armies, there's going to be a point where something sparks and you're going to have to use them. And if you have to use them, then it's all going to come crashing down very badly, as it did. Building up just causes more and more and more and more tension. These are long-term causes. When you have a small spark or a trigger, everything will ignite. The German army was also building up its reserves, I'll say getting up to near 1 million men, whereas the British still had its little volunteer army, its expeditionary force of about 250,000 men. The Kaiser, in fact, called it a contemptible little army, which the British, in their traditional good humour, was rather proud of. And the original soldiers that went over and fought in the Battle of Mons in 1914 called themselves the Old Contemptibles. Okay, this also links into imperialism. Britain has an empire. Britain has the largest empire in the world. About 25% of the Earth's land, the Earth's populated land mass is controlled by London. But Germany, a new nation, only created after that Franco-Prussian War in 1871, wants a piece of the pie too. They're taking parts of North Africa, Tanzania, Zanzibar. They are beginning to take slices out of Africa, and Britain has its own interest there as well. Of course, to have an empire, you need a navy, so the two are linked. Now, imperialism is the I, so we've had M, A, and I of main. So the building up of your empires, that's a threat to our empire, it was a threat to the French Empire, and a threat to the Italian Empire, in fact. And it built tension, more weapons, let's take more land, let's try and get more power. We were really laying the foundations for one heck of a knuckle dusting fight here. Okay, and lastly, nationalism. This is the N. Now, nationalism works in two ways. Firstly, you have a nationalism where you think your country is the best. And Germany certainly feel that they are the best. They feel they have the best army, they feel they're the best equipped, they feel that they have the bravest, strongest soldiers, the best form of government, the best military. Problem is, Britain also thought pretty much the same. So there was a lot of ego at play. The other reason nationalism was a cause is more of a short-term cause, and it was that Gavrilo Princip was a Serbian nationalist. He wanted to get rid of the Austro-Hungarian Empire out of Serbia, and when he shot the Archduke, he was doing it for nationalistic reasons, a pride in his country, wanting to unify it. Okay, so what happened? Well, after the shooting the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, I'll just scroll back, this happened. The alliances all kicked off, apart from Britain. So you now had Austria, Germany at war with Serbia and Russia, and France has now declared war on Germany and Austria-Hungary. Britain is not in this at the moment. So, what was Germany's plan?